Hey, good morning. Welcome to Redwood Church. We are so glad that you've joined us on this Sunday morning. It turns out that this Sunday is the first Sunday in fall. Yesterday was the autumnal equinox. It happened actually at 2:50 yesterday morning, so it's officially fall, y'all. If you've known me for any amount of time, if you've joined us and been a part of the Redwood family, you know that fall is my favorite time of the year for so many reasons. Maybe the most important reason is that we begin to get some cooler temperatures. This morning, the first thing I did was open the door, stepped outside, and just kind of breathed in that fresh, cool air that marks the beginning of fall. Now, I know that it's Georgia and it's Atlanta, and we're likely to get one more little snap of hotter weather, but this past week has been delightful with cooler mornings and a much drier air. The dew point's been way down, and so it has been absolutely beautiful week. There's so many things that mark fall. Now, for a lot of you're excited that fall is here because it's the beginning of pumpkin spice, everything pumpkin spice now, and so that's actually been out for several weeks now. So you can get your pumpkin spice latte, you can get just about pumpkin spice anything. Now, if you've been in the stores recently, the Halloween stuff has been out for a while. I think I've shared with you that I love the Reese's. They're not cups because they're happened throughout the year. They started off as Reese's trees. So the first were the trees at Christmas time. So you get Reese's Christmas trees, and then we got Reese's Hearts for Valentine's Day, and then Reese's Eggs for Easter. And now we have Reese's Pumpkin. So throughout the course of the year, we get a different Reese's. And so that's one of my treats during the day. So I'm excited for the return of, Shannon came home from the grocery store one day and had a big smile on her face, and she pulled a bag of Reese's Pumpkins out of the bag. And I know she knows my love language when she brings home my Reese's Pumpkins. I love fall, and generally I preach some kind of sermon on the fall, and so over time I want to find something new, a new way to express the thoughts around it. And over the past few weeks, even before yesterday, which was the official beginning of astronomical fall, meteorological fall, they say, actually begins September 1st. And if you remember, we've talked about this before. The equinox means equal night, so theoretically, the fall equinox falls. It's when the sun passes over the equators directly above the equator, which at the equator creates exactly equal amount of daylight and darkness at that particular spot. For us, since we're further north of the equator, that day that actually is almost close to equal 12 hours of light and 12 hours of darkness actually occurs tomorrow. So tomorrow we'll have almost exactly 12 hours of daylight, 12 hours of darkness. And now, between now and the winter solstice, then days will get shorter and shorter and shorter. We'll have less and less daylight, more and more darkness, until we kind of turn the corner at the winter solstice. And so what I learned in reading this, so over the past few weeks, even before those dates hit, I started to notice a change in our landscape. I think I've shared with you that we are so fortunate to have just an absolutely beautiful piece of property, and there's separate gardens with different plantings in around our house. And over time, over these, we've been in this house now 4 years, is I can mark the seasons by how my landscape is behaving and what plants are blooming, what plants are losing their leaves, what plants are budding. So this week, I looked outside, and our Camellia sasanqua, we got our first bloom on our Camellia sasanqua. Over the summer, I started to see as the buds formed, and then suddenly this week I looked, and there was a lone beautiful Camellia sasanqua bloom, and those camellias over the next few weeks will just burst with gorgeous blooms all over, these white blooms. And at the same time, in that very same area of the yard, our limelight hydrangea that had been absolutely beautiful this summer had huge, gorgeous green foliage, big, beautiful, white, puffy blooms. The blooms had faded, and the leaves have begun to fall. And as I looked out this morning, almost all the leaves have fallen to the point where those plants are almost once again bare. And so I know that kind of ebb and flow, I can look in my yard, even if I didn't have a calendar, I could look in my yard and see that. And so I began to think about, well, what's causing all this? And we have ideas about that. But I want to start us, and this is a text that I'll read a couple times a year because I think it is so important and it reminds us of part of the truth of God's creation. And it's from Ecclesiastes, and it's chapter 3, verses 1 through 8. 1 through 8. It's this series of familiar couplets that we know, that there's the famous song that's written about it. And so I'll read for us from Ecclesiastes 3, 1 through 8. For everything there's a season, and a time for every matter under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck up what is planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up, a time to weep, a time to laugh, a time to mourn, a time to dance, a time to throw away stones and a time to gather stones together, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to seek and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear and a time to sow, a time to keep silence and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. There's one here that's not written, but I think is probably is understood in this, is that another one that could be added is that there's a time for rest and there's a time for growth. And as we come upon the fall season, that's the one that I focus on. Is there's all these seasons, and so the writer of Ecclesiastes reminds us that there are these seasons in life, and we go in and out of these seasons, and they happen. Some of them happen over large periods of time. Some of them happen more frequently, with more frequency. But this idea of rest and growth, as I said, the leaves have all fallen off of the limelight hydrangea. But as I look around the rest of our yard, I'm beginning to see, you begin to see some of the leaves falling from the trees as well. And I think most people assume that the primary reason that leaves fall off the trees is weather, it's climate, it's temperature. And although temperature does have a component to it, the primary response of trees losing their leaves is in response to the amount of daylight. So as the trees begin to sense less and less daylight, that is their signal, that is their trigger to begin the process of losing their leaves. And it's fascinating. I've read a bunch this week preparing for this, and there's no way to condense it down. And quite frankly, some of the articles I read, I don't understand. There's one from Purdue University. There's one from the National Institute of Health, the U.S. Forest Service. There's all these wonderful articles about trees and what happens to trees in the winter. And they're just some really, really incredible articles. And so one of them talks about that there is, in a tree, there's a cessation of active growth. And I love that when a tree begins that process of losing its leaves, it's entering into a period of cessation of active growth. Now, what's also interesting is it talks about the periods of rest that a tree has. And there's early rest and winter rest and after rest. So the trees right now are kind of going into this process of early rest. And what's interesting is scientists continue to study trees, and even the colors that we have, we know what creates some of the colors. But for example, the trees that have the bright reds, there's still a lot of theory and disagreement, or not complete consensus among scientists as to why exactly red is a particular color. And that there's some who believe it is to prevent, attract insects, to repel insects away from it. It's that red helps to as kind of as a form of sunscreen for the tree, the plant, that protects the tissue below that's going to need to be healthy during the winter. So there's all these kind of theories and scientific research that goes on behind that. But generally speaking, we kind of just get back to the general idea is that as I look out my window right now and I literally can see tree leaves actively falling, a lot of the leaf fall early in this early rest is just any of the trees that were damaged over the summer, that the tree goes ahead and says, okay, you're not of much use to me. I'm just going to kind of let you fall away and go away. Now the other leaves, there's all of this, there are all these processes happening beneath the surface, all of these biological processes that are taking place within the leaves and within the branches and the stems and all of that life that goes into a tree. And what it's doing, it's consolidating all of that energy back into the core of the tree to prepare itself for the winter, for colder weather, for freezing weather. And all of that process is toward being able in the spring to re-begin the process of active growth. So while it's a cessation of active growth, it's always in a state of preparation for that next season of active growth. So you have these phases of early rest, winter rest, and after rest. It correlates very similarly to human rest in that we have this, we go to bed at night and there's these sleep phases. You have all these different phases of sleep during the night. And so we have, as I was reading about human sleep, we have 4 or 5 phases of rest. And we rest throughout the night, and much like a tree, our time of sleep helps us for our next period of activity. And in fact, when we're asleep, there's a period of time in which our muscles are paralyzed. And I didn't know this until reading this week, that part of the paralysis that we experience is so that our muscles don't react to our dreams. So when we're in our dream phase and we're dreaming, then the body has paralyzed itself so that we don't actively move our arms and legs like we would if we were doing the activities about which we were dreaming. Now, all of us have probably had the experience of kind of jerking ourselves awake, and we're probably in a lighter phase of sleep, and so our body isn't fully kind of paralyzed in that process, and so we react to what we're dreaming about, which is startling. We kind of wake up and realize that we were just responding to something, reacting to something about which we were dreaming. So we follow the tree in its season, and these trees will begin to go into that process of dropping their leaves and preparing themselves for the season of winter, during which they will rest, but at the same time, always beneath the surface, all these biological processes going on to prepare it and protect it throughout the winter. And then obviously we'll begin to see buds set, and then as spring approaches, we'll begin to see those buds blossom and bloom, and the leaves will return. When it becomes time for us to wake up in the morning, our body begins to wake itself up. The muscles are revived, and we come back to life so that when we wake up, we're prepared for that next season of activity. And so all of this comes to this point, that there are seasons that are longer that prepare us in the very same way, that each of us goes through seasons of life in which we're very, very active, and there's seasons of life in which we're a little bit more we're a little bit more still, that there's that period of dormancy that we go through. And much like the tree, from the outside, it would look like that there's a cessation of active growth. Several years ago, I had the privilege of being able to take a sabbatical. And so during that time of sabbatical, I was not preaching regularly. I wasn't doing this every single Sunday morning. I was doing a lot of different other activities, but there were parts of my life that there was a cessation of active growth. But there were other parts of my life that were preparing me for that next phase. And that next phase for me was, as part of what I was praying about, I was praying, Shannon and Zach and I were all praying and discerning what that next phase of ministry would be for me. And I say all three of us because ministry whether we like it or not, involves our entire family. So what I was going to do was going to have tremendous impact on my entire family. And so as I went into that season of sabbatical, you had plans, and I followed through on some plans. There are other plans that I didn't follow through on. I'm still, have this book hanging out there and piddle with it and dabble with it. So that's something that could be another season where you work on that. But I did prepare myself so that as I emerged from that season of dormancy, that season in which there were areas that were not actively growing, we were prepared to launch Redwood. Could have never imagined that as we were preparing to do that the world would be thrust into this unexpected season of dormancy called a pandemic, where we were all kind of secluded to our homes for a period of time. And that's another sermon for another day, as we're just now able to look back and see the impacts of what that was, some good, some bad, some indifferent. But as you think about your life, as we think about our lives, one of the things that talked about the human sleep cycle is that the brain repairs itself, and during sleep, there's some researchers that believe that the brain cells actually shed themselves of toxins. So when we're sleeping at night, our brain cells renew and refresh themselves so that they can be prepared for that next season of learning and growth, and that our capacity to process information relies heavily, it's incumbent upon sleep, that we have to have that cycle of sleep so that our brain can rest, so we can release those toxins, so that in that next season we are prepared to process information and to use that information to do what we need to do. And so the same thing happens in our seasons of life, that those seasons of time when we're resting, one of the things that doctors advise for better sleep is to turn off our screens at least an hour before we go to sleep. And part of that is because those screens cause so much stimulation in our eyes, or the light. We're so sensitive to light. As I said with the trees, the primary trigger for trees to begin to drop their leaves is the reduction of hours of daylight. Our bodies are the same way. Our bodies respond much the same way on a daily cycle to the cycles of lightness and darkness. And so we need to shut down our minds and our brains. And so we need to shut them down by stopping, looking at these screens. There's glasses that help filter out the blue light. There's all these things to try to help us. I think that in general, we would all benefit from refraining from so much information, that we're inundated with more information than we are physically able to process. And so that is what probably is one of the greatest things we could do, is to begin to limit the amount of information coming in so that we're more efficient in the way we process it, which allows us to be more effective in doing what it is that God has called us to do. So there's one of my favorite episodes of one of my favorite TV shows is MASH. It's called A War for All Seasons. And it's interesting that in the middle of a season of a television show, this particular episode goes through an entire year, which is, problems continuity-wise. And so you just have to, we've talked a lot about suspension of disbelief, but in the course of this season, Margaret is knitting what it goes from a scarf to a sweater to a blanket, and there's a garden that's planted in the middle of the compound that gets planted and grows and harvested and dies. And then we go through the entire baseball season in which Charles Emerson Winchester, who's not a normal sports fan, becomes intimately involved with it because he's made wagers with Klinger and others in the unit. That episode is so powerful because it shows the ebbs and flows of the year, and it encapsulates in an episode of MASH without commercials like 22 minutes. And so in 22 minutes, carries you through the entire season that would happen. And in the midst of that, it says a war for all seasons. In the background is the background of the Korean War that was going on the entire time. Our lives are much like that. As we go through our days, our weeks, our months, and the year, there are cycles daily, our sleep cycles. There are weekly cycles. And on the seventh day, God rested from all that God had done. God saw that it was good, and he rested on the seventh day. And he calls us to set aside a Sabbath day. So we're to get daily rest. We're to get weekly rest. Monthly, we should probably all take a day or two to just kind of do something for ourselves. And then within each kind of season, there's times we have fall break, winter break, summer break in the school calendar. And then annually, each of us try to take some kind of vacation where we get away and renew and refresh ourselves. And so as we begin the season of fall, as we are reminded of the words of wisdom from Solomon, from the book of Ecclesiastes, every season brings with it opportunities for rest and growth. And depending on what season you're in right now depends on what you're doing. And so maybe right now you're in a season of active growth, and so you are just going full out. Or maybe you've just finished a season of growth and you're entering into that time of beginning to rest. Or maybe you're in the midst of a season of rest and you're trying to quiet your mind and listen for God's still small voice to understand what it is that God is calling you to in the next season. So for right now, enjoy a pumpkin spice latte. Take some strolls outside as the leaves begin to fall and change colors. Take in a breath of the fresh, crisp fall air. Give thanks that God is in charge of it all and created it all and gives it to us as gift to enjoy as God's creation. Will you pray with me? Almighty God, we do thank you for this season of fall. We thank you for the gift of life, for the natural cycles that occur daily and weekly and monthly and over time. And so for all those gathered this morning, whatever season in which we find ourselves, that we know that the promise is that you are with us, that your Holy Spirit dwells among us. And we are reminded of your presence in the beauty of your creation, in all of its cycles, both in bloom and blossom, in times of dormancy and quiet. So God, as we begin fall, may we enjoy the beauty that is to come, the colors that will be bright and vivid. And as we enter into the season of winter, even though we may not be actively growing, we are preparing for that next season of growth. Bless us this day and throughout the rest of this week, for we offer ourselves in the name of Christ our Lord. Amen. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. I hope that you will stay connected with us on social media at RedwoodATL and on our website at redwoodchurchatl.org. If you would like to contribute to the mission and ministry of Redwood Church, I invite you to go to our website at redwoodchurchatl.org/give, or you can text Redwood Church to the number on your screen. Thank you so much for joining us. Have a great day. Have a great week. God bless. Take care.